Viktor Frankl was careful never to claim that all depression was a spiritual problem. He had too much medical and psychiatric training for that kind of reductionism, and he had too much respect for the real complexity of the human being. But he was equally careful to insist that not all depression was a biological or psychological problem, and that the failure to recognize the third possibility, the Noetic or spiritual dimension, was leaving enormous numbers of suffering people without adequate help. To understand Frankl's approach to depression, you first need to understand his concept of dimensional ontology. He described the human being as existing simultaneously on three levels, which he called dimensions: the somatic, or bodily, the psychic, or emotional, and cognitive, and the Noetic, or spiritual. This third dimension, the Noetic, was Frankl's most distinctive contribution to psychiatric theory. It is the dimension of the specifically human: meaning, values, conscience, the capacity for self-transcendence, the freedom to take a position toward one's own condition. It is not the religious dimension, though it may express itself religiously. It is the dimension in which a human being is more than the sum of their biological drives and their conditioning history. Frankl used the metaphor of a cube projected onto different planes to make this concrete. If you project a three-dimensional object onto a two-dimensional surface, you get a distorted, flattened image of something that is actually richer than the image shows. Medicine and psychology, in his view, routinely did this with the human being, projected a three-dimensional reality onto two-dimensional surfaces, the biological or the psychological, and then treated the resulting image as if it were the complete picture. Important dimensions were lost in the projection. For depression specifically, this meant that Frankl distinguished at least two fundamentally different kinds of depressive suffering that required fundamentally different responses. The first kind had its primary origin in the somatic dimension, endogenous depression, rooted in neurochemical and neurobiological factors, where the person's suffering is substantially caused by processes in the body and brain. Here, Frankl was straightforwardly in favor of biological treatment, medication, when appropriate. He had no ideological opposition to psychiatry's pharmacological tools. But the second kind had its primary origin in the Noetic dimension, existential depression, rooted not in neurochemistry but in the frustration of the will to meaning. Here, medication might relieve the somatic symptoms, the disrupted sleep, the physical heaviness, the blunted motivation, while leaving the underlying existential problem entirely untouched. The person, given antidepressants for an existential crisis, might feel somewhat better while still having no compelling reason to get out of bed. The relief is real but incomplete, and its incompleteness is itself a form of suffering. Frankl's clinical approach to existential depression was to work at the level where the problem actually lived, to help the patient encounter the question of their own meaning not as a philosophical abstraction but as an urgent personal demand. One technique he used was what he called the Socratic dialogue, a careful, probing conversation designed not to supply answers but to help the patient discover what they already knew at some level about what mattered to them, what they valued, what called them. Another was the perspective shift of imagining one's life from its end. Looking back from the vantage point of death, what would you wish you had done? What would you be glad you had done? This technique, which he called the mountain exercise in its more formalized version, had a way of clarifying values with startling speed. What Frankl observed, again and again, was that when the Noetic dimension was genuinely engaged, when the patient found a real encounter with their own meaning, however small, the depressive symptoms frequently began to lift without direct treatment. Not always, not in every case, and not without the continued importance of addressing somatic and psychic factors where they were relevant, but often enough to confirm his conviction that the Noetic dimension was not a spiritual luxury added on top of the real psychology, but a fundamental level of the human being whose needs were as real as any physical hunger. Modern research in positive psychology and meaning-centered therapy has broadly confirmed this clinical picture. Interventions focused on meaning, purpose, and values, not just the reduction of symptoms, show significant effects on both depressive symptoms and quality of life in populations as diverse as cancer patients, bereaved individuals, and people with treatment-resistant depression. The Noetic dimension Frankl insisted on has entered the evidence base. The question is whether the mental health culture is prepared to take it as seriously as he believed it deserved. Frankl's dimensional approach to depression is not a rejection of pharmacology or conventional psychotherapy. It is a demand that both be understood as partial instruments in service of a comprehensive vision. The patient is not a neurochemical system to be corrected, not a set of cognitive distortions to be restructured, and not a collection of relational wounds to be healed. The patient is a person, a unique, irreplaceable, three-dimensional human being whose suffering arises from specific causes at specific levels and whose healing requires specific interventions at each of those levels, including the one that medicine and psychology most consistently overlook. The physician of the soul that Frankl envisioned is not a specialist. They are the practitioner who has learned to see the whole. Subscribe to the Psychology of Viktor Frankl to explore more of his timeless ideas.